Well, good evening. It's good to see everyone here tonight. Very happy to see you all. Happy to see a little bit some that are visiting with us. There won't be a PowerPoint here tonight, so you'll just have to focus on my lovely face. But usually I have a bit of a preamble, but we'll save that a little bit further in. If you have your Bibles with you, I would ask that you would turn to Nehemiah chapter 1. Nehemiah chapter 1. And no, I'm not going to repeat, a lesson from Randy, because in the last several weeks, Randy has been talking a lot about Nehemiah on Sunday mornings. But there's something else that we can use Nehemiah as a jumping off point. Nehemiah chapter 1, and starting in verse 2, we get introduced, or actually we'll start in verse 1. We get introduced to Nehemiah. It says, the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in this month of Chislev in the 20th year while I was in Susa, the capital. So we're introduced to this guy named Nehemiah. We don't know what he does yet, but if we read in chapter 2, it says, and it came about in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, the wine was before him, and I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. So we see both in verse 1 of chapter 1 and chapter 2 a little bit about this person, Nehemiah. He is, as we'll find out in verse 2 of chapter 1, he is an Israelite. He is in captivity and has been for probably quite a while. And that he is in Susa. Now, Susa is the capital of the Medo-Persian Empire. This gives us an idea of where we are in history. We are in the time of Judah's captivity. We're past the time of the Babylonian Empire, and we're into the Medo-Persian Empire. And this guy, Nehemiah, is a cupbearer. His job is to serve wine to the king. We might be thinking, well, wait a second, what's a cupbearer? That doesn't seem like someone who, if you know a little bit about Nehemiah, isn't really somewhere you would expect his beginnings to be. He's not a prophet. He's not some leader of Judah. He simply is a cupbearer. And I want us to look back into chapter 1 and pick back up in verse 2. That Hananiah, one of my brothers, and some men from Judah came, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped and had survived the captivity in about Jerusalem. They said to me, the remnant there in the province who survived the captivity are in great distress and reproach, and the wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. When I had heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And after that, he goes into a prayer that, if you're curious what's in it, again, listen to Randy's sermon that he gave a couple of weeks ago, goes into great detail about the prayer. But we see this guy, Nehemiah. He is just a cupbearer. Yes, he's a cupbearer for the king, but he's not a noble. He's not someone who more than likely is that highly educated. This is a guy who is doing his daily job, and his brother and some other individuals come back from the province of Judah and tell him the state of the remnant that is left in Judah, a remnant that we can read a lot about in the book of Jeremiah. And things are not good. It's rough for them. The walls have been torn down from Jerusalem, and the city is in a sad state. And so Nehemiah becomes quite sad. It affects him deeply emotionally, to the point where, as we read in chapter 2 and verse 1, he usually is not sad in front of the king, but his emotions show. And in verse 2, turning back over to chapter 2 of Nehemiah, it says, so the king said to me, why is your face sad, though you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart. Then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies desolate and its gates have been consumed by fire? Then the king said to me, what would you request? So I prayed to the God of heaven. I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor before you, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. So, to set this historical context, we don't live in a nation with kings, and we haven't been in a nation of kings for many centuries. And one thing that was very common, and a very common idea, was that if you were the cupbearer, don't be sad in front of the king. The king does not want to be doesn't want his servants to be sad because it might make him sad. This was considered taboo or a no-no to show your negative emotions in front of the king if you were one of the king's servants. Many nations held to this tradition throughout, really for over millennia. This idea that servants should be happy or have a neutral expression. But Nehemiah on this one day was sad. And Artaxerxes, to his credit, sees this, and instead of getting upset, he wonders, okay, this guy's usually in pretty good mood, or he's usually stoic, but now he's sad. And the king could tell it wasn't just, you were sick, something is wrong in your heart. And Nehemiah goes out on a limb and tells the truth. He could easily have been put in jail or reprimanded for what he says to the king, because that could be seen as a criticism. If the king was in a poor mood, he could have easily taken Nehemiah and thrown him in jail. And yet Nehemiah is honest, and then the king allows him to make a request. And what does Nehemiah do that is, to me, is so amazing, and sort of the impetus behind this lesson? Is he volunteers himself to go and rebuild the walls of Judah, to go and restore the city of Jerusalem. Not someone else. He doesn't ask for the king to send someone to do it. He says, send me. I'll do it. He's not a wall builder. As far as we know about him, he's not an architect. This is a guy who's a cupbearer. That's his job. That's been his job for probably a while. And yet he hears of the state of Judah and is compelled and moved to such profound emotion that he then requests of the king, send me so I can go rebuild the walls. Not anyone else. Not going to have someone else take on the responsibility or request that the king fix this. Send me. He takes the responsibility upon himself. And I think so many people in a similar situation was said, yeah, Xerxes, could you send, one of your chief builders? Could you send, the general? Could you send someone to go fix this problem? And in many ways, this is maybe not the best solution. There might be guys who are probably more qualified than Nehemiah, but Nehemiah doesn't care about that. He says, send me. And along with some experts and some equipment and, all the things needed to do the job. But he first says, as we see in verse 5, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. That's amazing. And it reminds me of another story, and we're going to read that story before we get into talking about what is sort of amazing between these two stories and an idea that we can take from this. Turn over to the book of Luke. Luke chapter 10. And seemingly we're going in a completely different direction because we're going to talk about a parable from Jesus. And as we get into Luke chapter 10, in the first half of the chapter, he sends out a few to evangelize for the Lord. And then it comes back and he gets questioned by a lawyer. And after Jesus answers the lawyer asking, what shall I do to be saved, essentially, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus responds to him, but where I want us to pick up reading is in verse 28, after Jesus responds to the lawyer. And And he said, that being Jesus, he said to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." But wishing to justify himself, he said to Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" Because Jesus says, if you love your neighbor as yourself, you shall inherit eternal life. And the lawyer, being a lawyer, someone who wanted to be one for a long time, it's really easy to see the wiggle room here. Well, Jesus, tell me who my neighbor is. Because we want to narrowly define that. I can almost hear, those of you that understand this reference, that depends on what your definition of is. That same sort of reasoning that I think only the twisted minds of lawyers can come up with. Let's take something that's pretty clear, but let's really narrowly define that so I can have ways to wiggle around that. Is my neighbor just the person who lives next to me? Because then I only have to love like 2 families. That really is a lot easier than what Jesus' actual answer is. And so to answer the lawyer who is trying to wiggle out of his responsibilities by asking this probing question, Jesus answers him in the form of a parable. A parable that for some of you might be very familiar to you. And this is often referred to as the parable of the Good Samaritan. Picking back up in verse 30 of Luke chapter 10. Jesus replied and said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, excuse me, and fell among robbers. And they stripped him and beat him and went away, leaving him half dead. And by chance a priest who was going down on that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise, the Levite also, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan who was on a journey came up upon him, and when he saw him, he felt compassion, and came to him and bandaged up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them. And he put him on his own beast and brought him to an inn and took care of him. On the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper and said, 'Take care of him, and whatever more you spend when I return, I will repay you.' Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robber's hands?" And he said, "The one who showed mercy toward him." Then Jesus said to him, "Go and do the same." So in this parable, Jesus sets up 3 individuals that go past a man who gets robbed and stripped and left for dead on the side of the road. The first 2 are the ones who are seen in Jewish society to be the most pious. A priest and a Levite. Right? A priest obviously is supposed to, they're the holy men. They take care of the worship to the Lord. And Levites, they are the tribe of the priests. These are the 2 men in Jewish society that you would think would be the most righteous, the most pious. And yet they just walk past this man who is beaten half to death on the side of the road. And in fact, they don't just walk past him, they make sure they go on the opposite side of the road to make sure that, he doesn't get in their way. That they don't trip over him or, don't want to get too close to the man who's beaten and bloodied. But a Samaritan, now remember, a Samaritan is someone who by the Jewish law and by Jewish custom is seen as the lowest of the low. You're not even supposed to talk to a Samaritan. They are valued in Jewish society as below dirt. And yet, the Samaritan is the one who stops and doesn't just help the man, he goes above and beyond to show love and compassion to the man who is broken and beaten, inconveniencing himself, taking time and effort and even money to help the one who is in need. And that is the love that Jesus, of course, refers to in verse 27. Thou shalt love thy neighbor, the Lord thy God, with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy strength and with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as yourself. Love thy neighbor as thyself. And this is a lesson that is, of course, pointed out by the Samaritan. Now, you might be sitting here wondering, what in the world does this have to do with Nehemiah? How does the parable of the Good Samaritan relate to Nehemiah? Well, before we answer that, I want to quote something else, another document, that will lead us to kind of where I want us to think about for the remainder of this lesson. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Now, some of you may not know what document that is that I'm quoting. That's the Declaration of Independence. And this section is a little bit hard to understand because we just don't talk or write this way anymore. But essentially what it is saying is that after a time of abuse, those who have the ability to do something about that abuse, to stop something that is wrong, they don't just have the right, they have the responsibility and the duty to do something about that wrong that is being committed. To take action. It is their right, their responsibility, and their duty to take action. That lies at the heart and core of why the founding fathers did what they did. They felt that they had the responsibility as human beings, because they were seeing an injustice being done by the British government, that they felt in and of themselves compelled to a duty and responsibility as those with means to throw off the abusive powers. Now, whether or not that is true or to debate the merits of that, that's not really anywhere where we want to go with the sermon. But it's something that always rings very true in my mind, is this idea that those that have the ability to take action, the means to take action, have the responsibility and the duty to take action. And we see this idea as a combining thread between Nehemiah and the Good Samaritan. In Nehemiah, we see a man who is a cupbearer. He's not a general. He's not an architect. He's not really even a noble. He's just put in a position where he's able to talk to the king. And when he hears of a absolutely desperate situation of the people of Judah, the city of Jerusalem, being in dire straits, he feels compelled to action and is driven to do something that by most worldly standards of wisdom would be a foolish act. To act the way he did to the king, to say what he did to the king. Of course, God is on his side, and this is what God wants to see happen. But if we look at this from just a purely under-the-sun perspective, what Nehemiah did would seem foolish. He puts his own life at risk for people he's probably never met, never seen, hasn't been to in who knows how long, and is willing to volunteer himself to fix a problem that he's probably not even that well equipped to deal with. We don't know if he's a leader. We don't know about his background. But it would seem that if he had a really qualified background, he probably wouldn't be a cupbearer. But whatever it might be, Nehemiah feels compelled to action because he sees a problem. And that problem compels him to do something about it, even though he himself might have a laundry list of excuses to say, no, I'm not going to do that. Or, I'm really busy being the cupbearer. I don't have time. That's not convenient for me. So many excuses that he could have said, and some of which would seem really reasonable. Right? He could have said, well, I'm not an architect, so King Artaxerxes, send someone else. But he didn't. He volunteered himself to fix the problem. And then if we look at the Good Samaritan, you have two people that pass on by. Why might they have passed on by? Well, maybe they were in a hurry. Maybe they had the job to go to. Maybe they didn't see it. Though I doubt that, but still, these are excuses. Something else, it could inconvenience them. They didn't have the money to care for somebody else. They didn't have the time. They didn't have the resources. But yet the Samaritan, the one who is seen as lower than dirt by Jewish society, he stops and provides care. Why? Because he's stirred to compassion, because he sees a problem that he can fix, and he feels compelled by his compassion into the responsibility, the duty to do something about it. He sees a problem and he feels that he can help it, so he steps in to fix it. He doesn't say what maybe the other two men said, which was, someone else will take care of it. Someone else can fix this problem. Oh, the Good Samaritan says, I'll fix this problem. There's an issue, I will take action to resolve it. And that he does. And we'll get to this point a little bit later of how far they go. But this is something that when looking at Nehemiah and looking at this parable, that is a very strong thread, is this idea of seeing a problem and taking action regardless of what excuses a person might have, regardless of whether they're the best equipped. Because they realize they could help the situation, so they are compelled to take action. Again, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such a government. They feel compelled to take action because they have the ability to take action. And that creates within them a responsibility to do so themselves. And so, for the remainder of time, I want to talk about some impediments that we might have to doing this, because when we really look at Nehemiah, and we look at the parable of the Good Samaritan, taking out the ideas of love, but what we, and that being a responsibility we all have, we all can see things in the world that are problems, that are issues. And how many times do we just walk right by like the Levite and the priest? And there's so many excuses that we have. Again, we've listed out some of them, but to put more concretely in a list, time. Time is often an excuse. I don't have time to deal with this. This is an inconvenient time. It's not the proper time. When is it ever a good time? I'll pick on a friend of mine. I was listening to a conversation, and he was talking about, he'd been dating a girl for quite a while, and the conversation has come up, okay, so when are you guys going to get engaged? You're clearly very serious. When are you going to, take the next step in your relationship? And the first thing he said was, well, I need a better job. The time's not right. I don't have enough money. I want to be able to do this, do that, do this. It's just not the right time. And me and another friend of mine, we almost said it at the same time, and we both say, so when is going to be the right time? Because we as human beings can always come up with an excuse of why it's not the right time, why we don't have enough time, why it's not the right situation to do X, Y, or Z. But at the end of the day, we should say to ourselves, we should hit a point, say, okay, if not now, when? Do I have the ability to do something about this now? Because if I wait on it, I'm never going to do it. Right? We were all high schoolers once. And if any of you were like me, I'll do that paper later. I'll do that paper later. I'll do that paper later. 30 minutes before class. I think I should do that paper. Right? We always put things off. Many of us, shall I say, don't want to make too much of an absolute statement, but many of us always put things off. We can always have that excuse. Not the right time, not enough time, not a good time. So when is? The other excuse that we can often hear. Well, I'm not the right person for the job. I don't have the ability. I'm not smart enough. I'm not charismatic enough. I don't know enough. I'm, not an architect. so on and so forth. I'm not a doctor. I use the architect and doctor very specifically to apply to Nehemiah and the Good Samaritan, respectively. We can always say, well, and this goes along with the third excuse, which is, well, someone else can handle that. Someone else would be better. I'm not the right person, but someone else will be. Well, then, how many times does the buck have to be passed till someone actually does something? We say to ourselves, well, I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not this enough. I lack the ability to handle this problem. Someone else will take care of it. To really step on some toes, including my own, the elders will take care of it. The preachers will take care of it. So-and-so who's really good at talking to people, they'll take care of it. Someone else can always take care of it. We're never going to run out of a list of names or a list of people that can do the job better than us, but when are we going to do anything then? If someone's always better than us, when do we do anything? When do we get to the point to say to ourselves, you know what? I see a problem. I may not be the best person. There may be people with better ability, but you know what? I'm going to do something. And maybe later down the line, I can pass it off or get some advice and grow in my own ability. But this problem's in front of me now. I'm going to take action. Maybe I'm not the best architect. Maybe I'm not a doctor, but I can do something. Just like with the Samaritan, he did something. He helped tend to his wounds. I doubt he was a surgeon. I doubt he knew the exact way to set the bone or whatever he might have done. It just says he tended for him. And then he put him up in a place to stay, to rest, and provided food. He did something. Maybe we're not the best at everything. Maybe we're not the best at evangelism. We're not the best at talking to people. We're not the best, at handle every single situation. But we can do something. And if we feel ourselves at a lack of ability, while we're doing it or afterwards, we can say, hey, I'm not an architect, but you know what? I started this job and maybe I can go ask so-and-so who does know a lot about building, and they can help me. But I'm going to take the first steps now. Because if we keep passing the buck and saying, well, the next person will do it, the next person will do it, then when it's 20 people down the line, the problem is still sitting there and nothing gets done. And then it's back on us. Do we just let the problems of life fester? Or do we, like Nehemiah and like the Good Samaritan, say, you know what, I see a problem, I'm going to take action. I'm going to fix this. Because at the end of the day, and this is the last point I really want us to camp on, is at the end of the day, we have the responsibility as individuals to be accountable for our actions. Life as a Christian is about individual responsibility. We see this in so many places. And one of the first places that comes to mind is 2 Peter chapter 2, where it talks about, be ready to give a defense for the hope that lies within you. That's an individual responsibility. Be ready as an individual to give a defense. That's an individual responsibility. Or in 2 Timothy, in chapter 2, it talks about, Paul tells Timothy to be diligent, to be a workman, approved by God, and to handle the Word of God correctly or accurately. That's an individual responsibility. That's not something where we just get to pass the buck and say, Well, I'm not really prepared to give a defense, or I'm not really a diligent workman because, Randy didn't preach enough sermons about it. Or the elders didn't set up enough Bible classes for it. It's an individual responsibility. We have to be diligent to show ourselves approved as a workman. We have to be ready to give a defense for the hope that lies within us. At some point when we see a problem, when are we going to take the responsibility to take an action? And this is something I know some of you may hear this and go, okay, yeah, another sermon where the preacher talks about the congregation, doing X, Y, Z. It's not what I want to think of this sermon as. To think of it, the reason I'm preaching this and the reason this really stuck with me is the fact that there are individuals that we can look at as examples that are inspirational. The story of the parable of the Good Samaritan, I think oftentimes we look at it as, oh yeah, this is about how we're not doing enough. The preacher wants to talk about, congregation, you really got to do more. Get out there, do service, go visit more, go do this, go write more cards, da-da-da-da-da. Go invite more people. And we often see it as, the responsibility of living up to the parable of the Good Samaritan. No, think of this as inspiration. This is what we could be doing. This is what we have the ability to do. We don't know anything about that Samaritan. We just know they were going down the road and they took action. They decided to do something about the problem they saw. That's it. Any of us can do that. Anyone with a functioning mouth and a functioning body can evangelize through example, through simply saying, I love the Lord, by doing what is righteous. Or we look at Nehemiah. Nehemiah was most likely not the best person for the job, but he did it anyway because he saw a problem and he went to fix it. That is not a burden that we're trying to lay on you on the pulpit. It is an inspiration. If Nehemiah can do it, a guy who's just serving cups to the king, man, look at what he did. He went and he rebuilt the walls. He did it. He took charge. Yeah, was it hard? I don't think Nehemiah would sit, if he were alive today, would sit here and say, oh yeah, that was an easy job. But he did it anyway. He volunteered because he saw a problem and he had the ability to talk to the king and do something about it. So instead of this being a sermon of, the preachers getting on the congregation to do more personal work, to do this or do that, no, I'm simply pointing out as something I was inspired by. I am inspired by Nehemiah. And I hope that the inspiration to see all the excuses left behind and someone just doing the job. Why can't it be, instead of saying, maybe it could be someone else, no, not me. We could maybe train ourselves and work on, and this is not easy. This is a lot easier for me to say. But this is worth doing. Why not me? Why not me take action? Why not now? Why not do something about this problem? And I'm sure Randy or any of you who've preached have had that moment where you go to a congregation that might be looking for someone and they're desperate to get someone that can preach on a Sunday morning, and you think to yourself at some point, why not me? Why not take a chance? Yeah, I'm not the best speaker in the world. I'm not the smartest guy in the world. But I can help. Or those of you song leaders, when you first started, were all of you talented? Okay, some of you probably were. But were you the best song leader in the world? No. Did you have the best voice in the world? I know some song leaders, they don't have good voices. But they get up there and they do it anyway because at some point, they feel compelled to take action. All of us can take action for the problem, and we can be the impetus to do something about it. We may not be the final person to do something about it. We may need help. We may be ill-equipped, but can't we just do something? And I think if all of us took the example of Nehemiah, there'd be a lot less passing the buck. Same with the example of the Good Samaritan. If we followed that, then problems can get fixed. Problems can be taken care of. Not saying you have to do it on your own. Ask for help. Nehemiah didn't rebuild the walls on his own. But feel that compulsion. When a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. If you see a problem, you have the ability to do something about it and the responsibility. I have the responsibility. You have the responsibility. All of us do. And we all have the ability to do something, especially when it comes to spiritual matters. And I hope that this is an inspiration and doesn't feel like a hammer beating, because my intent is not to beat with a hammer, but to inspire with this lesson. I never would have thought of the connection between Nehemiah and the Good Samaritan until I just had the light bulb moment, sitting there listening to Randy's sermon a few weeks ago. We all can do something. The question is do we have the strength and really the desire to push past the excuses? I can't answer that question for you. Only you can. And maybe this will give you something to think and chew on in the coming weeks and months and years of your life here on this earth. So we want to end with an invitation for anyone here this evening who is not a Christian, or if you're one who is a Christian. There's an invitation to help you in whatever situation might be, whether you are not a Christian, you desire to come to God through the waters of baptism, or you're one who is a Christian and have need of the prayers of your brethren, for you're in a situation that you cannot overcome on your own and you need help. If either of these be the case or be your desire here this evening, we are here to help you through whatever way we can to help your need and to help fill it, either through encouragement and prayer or to helping you fulfill the call of the gospel. If either of these be the case, either you desire the prayers of your brethren or want to answer the call of the gospel, we ask that you please come forward while we stand and sing the invitation song.